Welcome to Epoch Report, where we look past the headlines at the structures underneath. Today, the Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. threat to declare its sovereign territory is being debated as either a power flex or a sign of retreat. This matters because the strait carries a fifth of global oil, and any shift in its security reshapes energy markets and alliances. The argument hinges on whether this move is a coercive lever backed by real force or a hollow declaration that reveals a declining guarantor. Proponents point to the Fifth Fleet's patrols and deterrence. Critics cite expanding bypass routes and producer realignment. The question is not just what the threat means, but whether it can hold. Is this a reinforcement of order or an admission of its fragility? Now, let us get into it. Trump's threat to call Hormuz U.S. territory isn't a power move. It's a panic button, an admission that the old oil order is slipping. Reddit geopolitics post.
Admission? A president threatening to declare a choke point sovereign is a classic coercive lever, not a retreat. You're reading weakness into a flex. Flexes don't respond to the other side's agenda. Iran tied shipping to sanctions relief, and bypass routes are expanding. That's the setup, and the threat follows it. Reddit geopolitics post. Correlation isn't causality. Iran always links shipping to sanctions. That's their standard script. The bypass routes you cite are incremental, not transformative. But the direction is unmistakable. CNN reports Middle Eastern oil producers have flipped the script on Iran, cutting reliance on the strait. CNN Business. That's not a blip. That's a structural shift. Shift, maybe, but you're skipping the counter. The U.S. Fifth Fleet still patrols Hormuz daily, and no major tanker has been seized recently. U.S. Navy reports. That's not a paper tiger. The fleet patrols today, but the threat's timing reveals who frames the agenda. If the U.S. were confident, it wouldn't need to rhetorically redraw borders. It would just enforce.
Or it's a deliberate escalation ladder. Declaring territory changes rules of engagement. That's a legal and military lever, not a whimper. You're mistaking posture for decline.
Fair. It's a lever. But it's a lever that invents authority rather than exercises it. Real power doesn't need to declare Hormuz U.S. territory. It just deters. The declaration signals deterrence has already failed.
Deterrence failed? Iran hasn't blockaded anything. Tankers still move. The strongest counter is that the U.S. can enforce this threat militarily, and a bluff you can back up isn't a bluff.
Back up how? If the U.S. declares territory and then has to sink an Iranian patrol boat over a legal phrase, it escalates to war. That's why the threat is hollow. The cost of enforcement is political suicide.
Political suicide? The U.S. has bombed Iranian proxies without blinking. Military capacity isn't the issue. Resolve is. And you haven't shown resolve is gone, just that it's noisy.
Resolve fades when the stakes shrink. Middle Eastern producers closing ranks with Iran means any U.S. enforcement fight protects fewer barrels each year. CNN Business. Strategic retreat is rational.
Rational or not, the Fifth Fleet's presence is a fact on the water. U.S. Navy reports. If the threat is hollow, why keep the fleet there? They're not running drills for nostalgia.
Legacy. Oversized commands persist after the strategy dies. It's cheaper to float a fleet than to admit you've bet on the wrong choke point. The fleet is a monument, not a guarantee.
That's a convenient metaphor. But you haven't addressed the strongest case. If the U.S. declares territory and Iran fires one missile, the U.S. response would be catastrophic for Tehran. That's deterrence, not decline.
Catastrophic for Tehran, sure, and for oil prices, and for the U.S. economy. The threat is a bluff because it's unpalatable to cash. Iran knows that. That's exactly why they keep testing.
Tehran tests because they're threatened, not because they've won. You're mistaking Iranian noise for U.S. weakness. The fleet's patrol record speaks louder than any Reddit thread.
Reddit threads aren't my source. They report the threat. But the bypass routes are the material change. Producers have diversified specifically to blunt Iran's leverage. CNN Business. When leverage dies, threats talk louder.
Diversification reduces Iran's leverage, not U.S. power. If anything, a weaker Iran strengthens U.S. position, so the threat is still coercive, just aimed at a softer target. A softer target doesn't need a territorial declaration. You threaten to absorb a strait when you can no longer guarantee access. The declaration is a euphemism for, we can't protect the lanes by default. Or it's a warning to Iran that the default is gone. That's escalation in the classic sense. It raises the cost of Iranian miscalculation. You're treating a rhetorical threat as final, not as a first move. A first move announces a game you expect to play. When you're ahead, you don't announce, you play. The announcement is what you do when you've lost the initiative.
Then prove it's a pivot. Show me U.S. assets leaving the Gulf. Show me Iran seizing a tanker. Until then, the Fifth Fleet is the answer, and the threat reads as reinforcement, not retreat.
You want a smoking gun before the lever snaps, but the evidence of decline isn't explosive. It's structural. Bypass routes, producer alignment, and a threat that legalizes rather than enforces.
Enforces, legalizes, call it what you want. The bottom line is the U.S. has the capacity to back it up, and capacity is what prevents the test. You can't call that hollow. Capacity without credibility is just hardware. The threat's novelty, declaring territory, is an attempt to manufacture credibility from scratch. That's what a declining guarantor does. Or what a clever one does. Rebranding deterrence doesn't weaken it. It modernizes the frame. The conventional reading isn't blind, it just isn't cynical enough for your theory. Cynicism isn't the point. The point is that a guarantee that requires redeclaration is a guarantee in default. If the old order were solid, no one would need to say the words. Words matter precisely when stakes are high. Redeclaration is what presidents do when they want to be unambiguous. That's strength, not collapse. Unambiguous? It's ambiguous enough to require explanation. Real strength doesn't explain itself. That's why the stakes are what they are. If the threat is hollow, oil security is fiction.
Fiction or not, the tankers still move because the fleet is there, U.S. Navy reports. That's a measurable result. Concede that much, and your retreat thesis loses its teeth. Tankers move today because Iran hasn't called the bluff. Yet. But the expansion of bypass routes means the next test costs less for Tehran and more for Washington. The arithmetic is shifting. You're building a theory on a trend that hasn't inverted. I'll concede the threat might be performative, but performative strength can still deter. The jury hasn't declared decline. No, the jury is still deliberating, but the deliberation itself is the evidence. If the guarantee were creditor-proof, we wouldn't need the trial. The conventional view may be incomplete. Incomplete, sure, but not dead. The notion that U.S. power imposes order is frayed, not fiction. We'll agree on frayed. Frayed enough to expose the thread. That's the story. Not a clean fall, but a guarantee that's now contingent. Contingent security is the new order. Finally, on the Strait of Hormuz, the dialogue ends in a draw, with both sides agreeing the U.S. guarantee is frayed but not dead. The evidence of decline is structural, yet the tankers still move under naval protection. The threat may be performative, but performative strength can still deter. The jury is still out on whether this is a pivot or a retreat. That is all for this episode. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it worth your time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Leave a comment below with where you think this goes. See you next time.